Good afternoon, friends. I want to adopt the historian's ploy and say, as they say, this was the long 19th century. I want to say has been a long afternoon on the asymmetrical, and I want, of course, to push my luck and make it a little longer with these wonderful speakers, but not too long. So just wanted to say I am not going to introduce them individually. You have the program, you have their biographies, and their careers, and so I'm just going to let you judge them by what they have to say here and now today. I will be very brief. I want to say that in the morning when I spoke, I said that one of the things we did not want to lose sight of was the ethical, discursive, and even historical structure of asymmetry in a set of different disciplines. We wanted to be able to see the concept in its figural and phenomenal forms, and what each articulation of the asymmetric of the way in which it was constituted, whether risk or distinction or trade-offs were, what were the kind of paradigmatic ideas that constituted that particular invocation or enunciation of the term asymmetry. And I think that from that perspective, a little bit to the side of some of the more direct disciplinary confrontations, from that perspective, I think it's been an extremely interesting day. As I say, not to neglect the substantive arguments, but just the structure of the arguments around asymmetry. And what's been really, to me, fascinating are some of the aesthetic and ethical measures that have been introduced into the language of law and politics. The notion of scale as a form of judgment, more people, less people, inequality, equality, the question of insurgents and the state, these different scalar measures and how you balance between them and how you trade off, or in the nuclear case, where the balance of power lies, where the balance of harm lies, who is contesting whom. These very delicate, fragile, ambivalent measures through which the discourse has proceeded all afternoon has been to me a real lesson in the understanding of asymmetry, both as a philosophical, an aesthetic, ethical and political issue. How we've constituted it here and now. Not simply what we've brought to the table, but what we have in these kinds of interdisciplinary discussions been able to reveal of the concept. So I want to thank the panelists who have come to us before. I want to thank Jeremy Waldron for his remarkably interesting lecture, which really highlighted some of these structural issues and forms of structural negotiation and construction. And now I want to open up to our panel. I want Lital to set off, and then we'll have Faisal, and then Emil, then we'll have a little discussion amongst ourselves, and then open up to the audience very quickly, because the hour is late, and I hope there will be lots of conversations generated here, and I'm sure you're dying to go out to dinner together to discuss this conference and to put it on Twitter and Facebook and send messages all over the place saying what a great afternoon. I don't want to deter you from doing that. So let's get on with it. Before I ask Faisal to speak, I just want to mention that the Humanities Center will be hosting David Grossman here on I think it's going to be an October date, and I think the date we're aiming for is October the 7th. Please put it in your book if these issues are important to you and many others. So I've just been speaking with him, and he will be here, I think, on October the 7th to speak at the Rita Hauser Forum for the Arts sponsored by the Mahindra Humanities Center. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lital. Faisal, you can speak from here, you can speak from there, whatever you prefer.
Thank you very much, Homi, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. Lital's presentation, I think, showed us how difficult it is to maintain the separations of asymmetry. That the symmetrical, whether genuine or not, keeps creeping back in various forms. And she spoke about the specter of comparisons, of course. In a way, my talk follows hers quite nicely, because I'm interested in the possibility of occupying the other's world as well. Now, let me start then by, in a rather unoriginal way, by talking about the asymmetrical relationship between a hierarchy, say the United States or any other state, an international and domestic hierarchy on the one hand, and a network on the other, say a global movement, if you want to call it that, or phenomenon like Al-Qaeda. Now, I'm sure I need not define hierarchy and network. These things are now already familiar. They're the stuff of journalism. What I'd like to do is to suggest that the hierarchy, though it might prevail in terms of military force and political institutions, almost inevitably becomes, or rather internalizes its opposite. The network always ends up residing in the hierarchy in all kinds of ways. So one way, of course, this happens if we look at, say, the United States and Al-Qaeda, is the way in which various Al-Qaeda spokesmen betrayed, since it seems to be a movement of the past now, such an intimate familiarity and comfort with the world of their enemies. They occupied that world, right? Both rhetorically. So if you were to look at, in his day, Osama bin Laden's various pronouncements and prognostications, they all betrayed great familiarity and intimacy with the world of his enemy and made comparisons of the kind that Lital has described all the time. President Bush, his ostensible enemy, of course, did quite the opposite. He was interested, again, going back to Lital's work, in making the separations which are constantly collapsing. All right? So that's one way in which rhetorically the network comes to occupy internal space within the hierarchy. Another way, of course, is more instrumental. Famously, the 9/11 attacks made use of American aircraft from American airfields and cast them into American buildings. It was all internal in that sense, to say nothing of homegrown terrorists and all the rest. But thirdly, of course, and very interestingly, you can see the way in which the network makes itself at home in the hierarchy by the way in which, say, let's take the example of Abu Ghraib, the way in which the American military itself or certain actors within it end up taking on a networked role within the hierarchy itself. So whereas commentators in this country have addressed the abuses at Abu Ghraib by trying, sometimes a bit too desperately, to link them to a chain of command and therefore make these soldiers responsible, entirely and fully responsible in an entirely hierarchical manner, you might also see them as operating in a covert and subversive way within the hierarchical institution that is meant to be the military, of sharing their own vulnerability by exchanging these photographs, by coming up with all kinds of odd and even treasonous statements about the US Army itself, even as they were within it, and of disturbing in this way the hierarchies by which the military is itself meant to work. I don't want to attribute this network within the military entirely to an imitation of Al-Qaeda or because it happened to occur at Abu Ghraib, but I'm interested in seeing the similarity and the way in which networks can be absorbed by hierarchies, but the reverse is really the case. Now, having offered these preliminary examples, I would like to suggest that they tell us something of more consequence. One of the interesting things about Al-Qaeda's argumentation, after all, was the fact that it depended almost entirely upon the logic of mirroring, right? And you know this, we all know this. It's quite simple in a way. You kill our civilians, so we kill yours. You torture our people, so we torture yours. Now, this, of course, is a way of evading legal or legalistic responsibility, though you might wonder why that needed to be done, given the fact that these people were making these statements from caves in Afghanistan and not in a court of law. But of course, it does more than this. The logic of mirroring actually deprives or evacuates the Al-Qaeda militant figure of all ontological weight altogether, right? I mean, so what we do is, in a way, a reflection of what you are. We are your reflection. We don't have any ontological weight, almost. The only thing that they did claim for themselves is, of course, sacrifice, the suicide bombing, and the suicide bomber as the great icon of Al-Qaeda. But even that was a form of laying claim to particularity that was forever being threatened by the potential sacrifice of their enemies, the greater potential sacrifice of their enemies. The other way in which particularity was claimed was in a rather superficial way, in mere appearance, turbans, beards, this sort of thing. Otherwise, the logic or the rhetoric is entirely one of A, familiarity, and B, of mirroring, all right? As if, after all, this is a mirror, there's nothing behind it. You have a subject voided of interiority. Now, one of the things I think let me offer you another example of this. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the so-called mastermind of 9/11, if you were to read, it makes very interesting reading indeed. The transcript, redacted though it is, of his tribunal hearing at Guantanamo Bay, he adopts a position of, as it were, legal pluralism, if I might put it that way. He says, look, I, of course, don't believe in all the structures of law that you believe in, but nevertheless, I will, since you don't believe in what I believe in, I will argue as if I were one of you. I'm going to argue entirely according to your categories and concepts. So there, too, there is a recognition that of incommensurability on the one hand, but on the other, the willingness to adopt the language, the guise, and if you will, the identification, if not identity, of the other. It's almost as if we are talking about the difference between the Charles I kind of legal defense of incommensurability. I have divine right. This court cannot judge me. And since he was mentioned by Professor Waldron, the Gandhi view, which is to say, my standards are not those of not your standards, but nevertheless, let me plead guilty in your court, and let's see where that takes us. All right. One is a pluralistic vision, and the other is not. It enacts a confrontation. So, having set this up, this story of hierarchy and network, of the internalization of the network by the hierarchy, and of the voiding of, as it were, ontology or ontological weight, all of which, of course, makes perfect sense. We're dealing with a global network like Al-Qaeda used to be. What I would like to go on to argue here is that one of the things the global war on terror did, whether by intent or by default, was to end up re-territorializing and externalizing this threat. So the threat that was all too internal, the threat that spoke in your name, spoke as you, attacked you from within, had to be externalized and territorialized. So you attack Afghanistan and you attack Iraq. You create theaters of war which are more conventional, and in this way you externalize and territorialize or re-territorialize the threat. I would like to suggest that it is the success of that maneuver that has opened the door to the emergence of something like ISIS. And you see this also in Al-Qaeda's response to ISIS. Mr. Zawahiri's response immediately after the declaration of the caliphate by Mr. al-Baghdadi was to say, no, this is entirely inappropriate. The real jihad is in Khorasan. It's east of Suez, as it were, right? It's in Greater Persia, in India, in Southeast Asia. He's globalizing or attempting to re-globalize in Asia. These guys are saying, no, here we are in Syria and Iraq, and we have declared the caliphate. Now, how do we see this? Is the emergence of ISIS with a state, with a territory, somehow a return to old-fashioned geopolitics of no matter how strange a sort? I'm not sure. ISIS certainly does retain some elements of Al-Qaeda's mirroring strategy or rhetoric, right? So for instance, the waterboarding of Jim Foley, right? A completely unnecessary act. It was meant to mirror what happens to unlawful combatants, right? In this country, or rather in Guantanamo. And there also, of course, you have the dressing of all these victims who are brutalized in these Guantanamo orange uniforms. So there are elements of that mirroring going on, of symmetry, if you will, going on. But they are rather limited. And they're also repudiated by other acts which don't belong to that logic at all. The burning to death of the captured Jordanian pilot recently, as you will remember. The suicide bomber is also no longer the great icon of ISIS-type militancy, as far as I can tell, and sacrifice is not its greatest, his greatest act, right? So we've moved beyond that voiding of ontological weight, if you will, or moved away from it anyway. What is a mark of ISIS is success. And I want to ask, in what remains of my time here, what does this ontological fullness, this presumed ontological fullness mean? If it is not simply a reassertion of geopolitics. Now, our accounts of such movements tend to posit and look for depth all the time. Either sociological depth, where is this coming from? Are these, kids from deprived families, or, these are war-torn societies, or there are any number of such accounts, right? So there's either sociological depth, something is behind it, or there is ideological depth. Right? There is some idea that people have been brought up, should we actually have imams trained in the West? Maybe, people should be, all of these kinds of explanations. Right? But what if it's not depth but surface that's actually important here? And I'll tell you why I think it is important. One, of course, has to do with the sheer rapidity of radicalization. This was also noted in the latter stages of Al-Qaeda's career. All right? We are no longer talking about these Cold War forms where you need to work on someone, brainwash them, you need time, you need to sequester them. Now it seems to happen very quickly, almost casually. There's rapidity. Also, the frequency of reversal. People might go to Syria but also come back. If you look at the British statistics, hundreds have also returned, and they don't necessarily have any sort of jihadist project. And finally, of course, the sheer number of converts. No radical Islamic movement has had so many. Al-Qaeda never did. Which, of course, then cuts out the notions of inheritance and cultural memory and all of that. And not least of ignorance. So you may also have heard of this situation where these British Muslims go off to Syria, and just before they go to Syria, they order 2 books on Amazon, Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies, which seems to, well, hang on, They're going to fight an Islamic fight, but they really don't seem to know very much about it. And they're self-conscious in their ignorance, so that they have to buy these books. It's almost as if it has to come after the fact. And that after the fact, I think, is an important thing, and I'll return to it. So it's not subjectivity with depth that's interesting, that might be important here, but rather a kind of subjectivity which is virtual or avatar-like, which is very thin, and which is, as I say, superficial. Now, ISIS itself is dominated, its rhetoric is dominated by a suspicion of depth and an obsession with transparency. So its vocabulary is made up of terms which are unfortunately only seen in medieval theological ways, right, by the commentariat. Hypocrisy, yes, it's a medieval term, right? It's in the Quran, hypocrites, right? Hypocrisy. Sorcery, Western media is seen as engaging in sorcery. Dissimulation, particularly for the Shia, who are seen as holding that as a theological doctrine, right? And let me cite you an example of this from the reputed, eminence grise, ideological eminence grise of ISIS, one Sheikh Adnani. The dispute by using sorcery, falsifying events, altering realities, and duping people. They deceive, incite, mobilize, and amass against the people of truth. They display the people of falsehood in every guise of strength, ability, force, and fierceness, in desperate and failed attempts to invalidate the truth, scare its followers, and defeat them. So that's enemies, America, etc. Then about the Shiites in particular. O Sunnis of Iraq, the time has come for you to learn from the lessons of the past, and to learn that nothing will work with the Rafida, the heretics, the Shia, other than slicing their throats and striking their necks. They make themselves out to be helpless so that they can take power. They conceal their hatred, enmity, and rage towards Sunnis. They plot and conspire against them, and they trick and deceive them. They display false affection towards them and flatter them as long as Sunnis are strong, and it goes on in this vein for a paragraph or more. Right? And this is entirely typical. An edict or a text which is completely obsessed by depth, by secrecy, by dissimulation, and utterly dedicated to surface, to transparency. Now, a lot could be said about the fixation on hypocrisy, and we might come back to that during the discussion. I'm thinking in particular of Hannah Arendt's treatment of this term and this theme in her book on revolution. At the time when during the Revolutionary Terror, when hypocrisy, which she describes as being otherwise a minor vice, becomes politically crucial. Right? But we can return to that, as I said. What I'm interested in is the fashion in which ISIS, from what one can tell of its texts and its activities, and this is not an explanation on my part, no one can have an explanation with the fragmentary materials that are available to us, but it's a line of thought or a line of argumentation. Is what interests me about this fascination with surface and the suspicion of depth, in which even the Shia are attacked not in any traditional theological way. It's not like there are a great many texts on the falsity of their choices of the succession to the prophet. It's all about dissimulation and hiddenness. So it can be read theologically, but it lacks many of the standard theological elements that have been inherited from the past. What interests me about this emphasis on surface and the suspicion of depth is that the ISIS rhetoric seems to be about the refusal of transcendence itself. It's about absolute immanence. So you would think that here is a religious movement that's dedicated to something that's outside, that's transcendent, something that cannot be grasped, that cannot be made visible. And yet it seems to be not the case, though of course the references to God are ubiquitous. You have, if you take the Caliph, for instance, So here is al-Baghdadi, the caliph, who you would think is this transcendental figure, this figure of sovereignty, but he's treated almost entirely as an entirely prosaic ruler. Right? There's nothing of the transcendental about him. If you take the magazine that is released in many different languages, Dabek, which is supposedly a reference to a town meant to host the Messiah, and therefore the apocalypse. And we are told a lot about the apocalyptic language of ISIS, which is true. But if you were to open this magazine, there's nothing in the least apocalyptic about it. It's entirely prosaic and anodyne. It's about happy, smiling children and offering medical help and education and computer classes. And I'm like, well, hang on, where is the apocalypse in all of this? There's a refusal of transcendence, but also in the very exercise of sovereign power. Okay? And the others in this room who might correct me if I'm wrong, one of the things about sovereignty is that it has to stand between, in a twilight zone, as it were, between the law and the world outside the law, because it must define the latter. It always must leave itself a space which is extra legal, even if it's only as a dirty secret, that you have winking knowledge of, that you will do something but you will deny it. Here you have no intention of denying. You have the absolute reliance upon the continuous display of brutality. And of course, you can say this is all instrumental. This is meant to convince others to join, and that might well be the case, but that is of no interest to me. I take that as given. What's interesting is the existential and cultural implications of that form of transparency, that way of showing everything, of denying nothing. Not just that, but of placing it all under the name of the law. All right? So this, and there are arguments with Islamic scholars, is this legitimate, is this legal, how might it be the case? Those in a way are beside the point, I think, as far as I'm concerned. Because what seems to be interesting is that ISIS appears to lack even the language of excess, which even Al-Qaeda militants had. All right? So it's not a question of, we will do only so much, or our excesses are in fact your excesses because we're mirroring what you do. That's not the reasoning. What in fact they are saying is everything we are doing is entirely legitimate. It's in the name of the law. We don't resign responsibility for it. We call it Islamic, and it is absolutely visible. It's almost as if there's an attempt to make sovereign power immanent in law itself. And by doing so, of course, it makes the law more and more brutalizing. It's like a kind of infernal machine that has been created. The very forms of transcendence which are meant to lie outside it, when captured by law, push the law in, and provide its internal dynamic or dynamism. And you see this in the lack of ambiguity or indeed room for maneuver in ISIS language and pronouncements. The declaration of the caliphate is exactly such an act. Al-Qaeda or Hizb ut-Tahrir before them had hesitated to take on this responsibility, had not named a caliph, had left themselves various kinds of room. By actually making this pronouncement, ISIS is cutting off all ambiguity, refusing all room for maneuver, and in fact making a last stand. And they are fully conscious of this. And I'll read you another statement from, and then be done, from Adnani. O soldiers of the Islamic State, be ready for the final campaign of the Crusaders. Yes, by Allah's will, it will be the final one. Thereafter, we will raid them by Allah's permission, and they will not raid us. Be ready, for by Allah's permission, you are befitting for it. The Crusaders have returned with a new campaign. They have come so that the dust clears, the fog disappears, and the masks fall. The language of hypocrisy and dissimulation, right? The masks will fall. And thereby the hoax of falsehood is exposed and the truth becomes clear, etc., etc. And this is exactly the kind of text that is used by commentators to indicate the apocalyptic nature of the movement, which is not visible anywhere else, right? I think what it indicates is the deliberate making of a last stand, the erasing of a room for maneuver, which I guess is apocalyptic in a sense. But what does this tell us? And I'll end here by what does this tell us? This last stand form of reasoning about the empty subject, the politics of the surface of this subject. The subject who's also an ignorant subject who has to buy books about Islam before going to risk his life in Syria. I wonder if what is being said to us in these texts and these video clips, etc., has to do with a wager, a kind of wager, and a kind of last stand in that sense. That not only is the full subject a subject with weight being rejected entirely, but the true Muslim subject or the militant subject who is to come is one is a subjectivity that can only be achieved posthumously. That the acts of violence are not in fact acts of certainty, they are acts of uncertainty. They are completely ambiguous. That the certainty, if it is meant to come at all, only comes after them. The wager is the violence itself. The wager is not made before the violence occurs. So I'll stop there and simply by saying that the movement from Al-Qaeda to ISIS is interesting in all kinds of ways. And one of the ways in which it is interesting has to do with the refashioning of the militant subject in both the rhetoric of these two forms of militancy, but in their practices as well. One for which sacrifice and the suicide bomber is crucial, and the not laying claim to caliphates, etc., etc. And the other for which visibility, transparency, a state, all of those things are all important, but for which the subject also remains entirely on the surface. So though it's no longer being mirrored, it's no longer one which is linked to a symmetrical relationship with the enemy, it is nevertheless one that, if it is to seek a fullness, that fullness occurs either posthumously or after the act of violence and not before it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Homi, and thank you to the Mahindra Centre for inviting me to speak on this panel. My talk is entitled The Asymmetry of Enemy Personality and the Paradox of Forever War. Having just finished his tenure as legal advisor to the US Department of State in May 2013, Harold Coe, formerly Dean of Yale Law School, gave a speech at Oxford University entitled How to End the Forever War. By forever war, he meant, in terms of US domestic law, the war prosecuted under the 2001 US congressional authorization to use military force against those nations, organizations, or persons that the President has determined, planned, authorized, committed, or aided the 9/11 terrorist attacks. In terms of international law, he meant the same conflict, recognized as a non-international armed conflict, fought on the basis of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. What exactly Coe meant by the adjective forever is open to interpretation. On the one hand, we could take it to mean simply a war that had by that moment already lasted 12 years, without a clear end in sight. Indeed, one sometimes hears the war on terror relabeled as the Long War. However, it strikes me that the proposition of forever war can be understood to mean not just any war that happens to be long, but a special concept of war that is of indefinite length at a conceptual level. That is, a concept of war in which the proposition of the absence of an endpoint is not anomalous, but routine, and indeed intrinsic to the concept. If the conflict against Al-Qaeda under the 2001 AUMF corresponds to such a concept of war, it is therefore unsurprising that it should appear endless. Yet if forever war does exist at a conceptual level, it presents us with a paradoxical concept, strategically and legally. Strategically, war has traditionally been understood as the ultimate instrument of decision in international politics. Yet because endless war subverts the basic idea of war as a decisive political instrument, it is contradictory to the very concept of war. Legally, if we define war or armed conflict as that state distinct from peace, then in a forever war there can be no peace, or at least no clear distinction between war and peace. We enter a grey zone between the two. Insofar as different legal regimes apply different bodies of law to war or armed conflict and peace, forever war carries the risks of blurring between the two. Take, for example, the wartime concept of the enemy on the one hand and the civil peacetime concept of the criminal on the other. The two concepts rely on modes of discrimination antagonistic to one another. Thus, the enemy is killed simply as an enemy with no implication of guilt or requirement for evidence. Conversely, the criminal is innocent until proven guilty. These two modes of discrimination are categorically incompatible, as symbolized most obviously through the last decade by Guantanamo Bay, in which those arrested as enemies, but without the evidence that would enable them to be tried as criminals, are held indefinitely in limbo, in a conceptual space between war and peace. More broadly, the strategic and legal boundaries that separate war from peace conceptually compartmentalize violence in the world. When they are blurred, violence is decompartmentalized as war merges with and contaminates routine political activity. We experience not just long wars abroad, but a militarization of domestic policy, with the attendant consequences for civil liberties, public debt, and executive power. Thus, if forever war exists at a conceptual level, as opposed to merely at a factual level, it raises serious strategic and legal implications for contemporary US and foreign and domestic policy and global order more broadly. To my mind, the forever war does exist at a conceptual level. It is not an anomalous concept. Historically, it has a long genealogy which we can learn from to better understand our contemporary predicament. It's a type of conflict that has legally been understood in terms other than war, and strategically been recognized as inhabiting an ambiguous grey zone between war and peace. I want to access that genealogy through the concept of asymmetry, specifically the asymmetry of enemy personality, which is foundational to the concept of forever war. Since much of the above-ground architecture of forever war lies outside the scope of this paper, while I can't walk you through the cathedral of forever war today, the exploration of the asymmetry of enemy personality will take us on a revealing, if rapid, journey through its crypt. Legally, the key conceptual choice made by the US government has been to characterize today's forever war as a non-international armed conflict of global scope under international law. The temptation, perhaps, is to see non-international armed conflict simply as a form of war involving non-state actors, vis-a-vis international armed conflicts, which are wars between states. That temptation obscures the historical reality that historically these forms of conflict were conceptually understood to be very different, specifically in the sense that non-international armed conflict was not seen as a form of war at all. The basic distinction goes back to ancient Rome. The main Roman term for enemy was hostis, of which there were two types, one legitimate, the other illegitimate. The distinction is based on what would later be rendered as sovereignty. Against the regular sovereign hostis, Rome fought regular wars. Hence we find repeated the claim that the hostis are those on whom the Roman people has publicly declared war. In this respect, the Roman legitimate hostis was a purely political designation, through which all members of the enemy political community automatically became a hostis at an individual level until the war was ended, when they would cease to be enemies. Moreover, a peace treaty could only be contemplated with the regular hostis, which forms a crucial distinction vis-a-vis the illegitimate enemy, in terms of how a war could be ended. The peace treaty allowed Rome's relationships with other recognized political communities to be understood in terms of periods of war or peace. Conversely, there were not distinct periods of war or peace against illegitimate enemies. Rather, there was a state of perpetual conflict. This makes sense insofar as those illegitimate enemies could be representative of abstract problems like piracy or banditry, in which an individual can activate an enemy identity by committing the prescribed act. But plainly, even if a peace could be made at an individual level, that would not mean peace could be made with the phenomenon as a whole. However, there were legitimate enemies who did have some kind of recognized political community, such as various barbarian groups. The key reason why there could be no peace treaty with the barbarian was thus an ideological one, similar to the idea today that we would never contemplate, at least I think, a peace treaty with, say, the so-called Islamic State, even if we recognise their capacity to enter into one. If fighting against pirates or bandits were understood simply as part of a perpetual conflict against the unembodied problems of piracy or banditry, how then did wars against barbarian groups who were embodied in physical communities end, given there could be no peace treaty with them? In practice, they ended through long-term political subjugation, as indicated by the etymology of the term province, which is from pro, meaning on behalf of, and vincere, meaning to triumph or to take control of. So in Roman times, we already have a distinction between two types of conflict based on the asymmetry of enemy personality. First, an asymmetry of legal personality, in that one cannot make peace with an unembodied problem. And second, an asymmetry of ideological disposition, which meant that even if an enemy had the capacity to enter a peace treaty, ideological bars to so doing put them in the category of the illegitimate hostis, against whom Rome was in perpetual conflict or perpetually subjugating. Roman concepts were mediated by the medieval just war tradition. The key difference was the way in which enemy status was activated. In the medieval just war tradition, the personality of the belligerent, sovereign or non-sovereign, was largely irrelevant, because the order of medieval Europe was fragmented. Popes, princes, lesser lords, bishops, independent cities, and mercenary bands all regularly used force on their own behalf. In this way, it is an interesting analogy to contemporary networked conflict, in which we are again seeing a range of non-sovereign actors regularly using force. What replaced personality in the medieval tradition as the key element in the concept of war was that the enemy status was activated not through membership of a political community, but rather through guilty responsibility for a wrongful act. We can illustrate this through the etymology of the term innocent, that is, a non-enemy, which is from in plus noxia, forming innocentia, that is, not responsible for the noxious thing, that is, the material harm that provides the just cause for the war. Now consider for a moment Harold Coe's speech again. This is quoting from Harold Coe now. The relevant question would not be one of labels, i.e., should we call this person an enemy combatant, but rather one of facts. Do the facts show that this particular person is actually part of Al-Qaeda or associated forces? The US response to a particular person thus turns critically on who he is and what he has done, not on what label he is given. Close quote. In other words, in today's forever war, the enemy identity primarily based on noxious act, with the enemy identity primarily based on noxious acts over group identity, we are close to the enemy of the medieval just war, which in turn is derived from the Roman illegitimate variety of hostis. Crucially, medieval writers still recognized Roman war, or bellum, which involved wars between regular hostes, which in medieval terms meant wars between princes. However, the use of force against criminal-like enemies was known as executio jurisdictionis, that is, the execution of a jurisdiction or armed law enforcement. This is similar to the idea in law enforcement today that the punishment of crime is a perpetual task, not amenable to clear moments of coercive action demarcated by the concept of victory. This builds on the Roman idea that the use of force against illegitimate enemies could potentially be endless, as the enemy either did not have the capacity to enter a peace treaty, and/or were so ideologically repugnant that one could not be contemplated. Moreover, when an enemy identity is identified through guilt, we see how the geographical and chronological limitations to the scope of a conflict are far weaker and more ambiguous than against a regular enemy. What counts as triggering responsibility for the noxious thing is typically ambiguous, and therefore stretches the scope of the enemy, and therefore the scope of the conflict. Is someone today who clicks like on an IS post on Facebook the enemy or not? That's ambiguous, and that's the point. Moreover, because unlike against a regular enemy who loses his enemy identity when the war ends, the criminal enemy can't lose his identity until punished, which is highly ambiguous as an endpoint. So it stretches the chronological scope of the conflict. Now, turning to modern international law, crucially for our purposes, the distinction between executio jurisdictionis and Roman war or bellum was ultimately to be taken up by modern international law in a modified form. Roman bellum ultimately became known simply as war, which was exclusively war between sovereign states, and in the post-UN Charter period, known as international armed conflict. This kind of war was ended by military battlefield outcomes translated into a peaceful settlement via a peace treaty. So military victory is a key boundary between war and peace. Conversely, international law in the colonial period through to the UN Charter period had very little to say about the use of force against what it called uncivilized peoples, who were not sovereign actors and had nothing to say about the use of force within state or imperial boundaries. The use of force in this context was typically understood in terms other than war, such as imperial policing. It was this use of force which was the successor to Roman war against the illegitimate hostis and the medieval executio jurisdictionis, which became the alternative category of non-international armed conflict of modern international law. Take, for example, the British attempt to keep in check the Pathan, now known as Pashtun, tribes on India's northwest frontier with Afghanistan, which saw virtually not a single year pass between 1849 and 1947 without one or more military campaigns in the region. For example, there were 60 campaigns before 1900 alone. And these weren't small campaigns, these are big campaigns with thousands of British troops. This was over the course of the century, an intensity of conflict unique in the world. The 1897 general uprising against the British led to the deployment of an army 44,000 strong in the Tirah campaign of 1897-98. This was the largest force ever deployed by the British in Asia to that point, including the two Afghan wars of the 19th century. The crucial point here is that at no point was the conflict in the northwest frontier ever understood as war. It was a form of jurisdictional enforcement that by the 1930s was known as imperial policing. Neither was the conflict shoehorned into the strategic model of war, insofar as a decisive end state was understood not to be available. It was really a case of continually enforcing a jurisdiction by creating stability vis-à-vis a range of tribes through a mixture of threats, force, and money. There are two reasons to my mind why we misidentify today the conflict label as forever war when historically these types of conflict have specifically been understood not to be wars, and both turn on the concept of symmetry. First, the key conceptual evolution in post-UN Charter international law, especially since the 1990s, has been the gradual erosion of the boundary between international and non-international armed conflict, the respective successors to bellum on the one hand and executio jurisdictionis on the other. The primary motivation of this move has been humanitarian, to give illegal combatants the same rights as their regular enemies, that is, to create a legal symmetry in the absence of political symmetry. Second, because Western strategic thought is still fixated with Clausewitz's concept of decisive battle and unconditional surrender. We apply this strategic concept, which looks for a decisive battlefield victory, to any concept that might factually be labelled as a war in the sense of being above a certain threshold of violence, regardless of its legal character. There is a desire here to form a strategic symmetry between all conflicts, specifically in the proposition that all conflicts are amenable to analysis through the military concepts of victory and defeat and clear boundaries between war and peace. The reason why it is more urgent for us to understand the conceptual roots of the distinction which these two trends are erasing is that unlike the Northwest frontier, which was a regional issue, due to the networked conflict produced by the information revolution today, we experience the effect of perpetual conflict at a global level. This leads me back to Harold Coe's question, how do you end a forever war? It seems to me that chronologically we cannot end it, so we need to find other ways to limit and compartmentalize its scope so as to maintain, so far as possible, clear conceptual boundaries between war and peace. This in turn requires an approach which at its core requires ideological and geographical differentiation as to the different tranches of the enemy. And that differentiation in turn requires a greater stratification within the noxious thing that association with triggers an enemy identity. This move would allow us, in relation to many of the tranches of the enemy, to move beyond the strategic fixation on decisive battle and unconditional surrender. Thank you.
Thank you. The hour is late, and I'm not going to try and fit these various presentations into a kind of pattern. I'd much rather just open up to the audience for the next 15 minutes or so, before we lose much of our audience, hear from you, and then allow the discussants to elaborate on their issues or to speak to each other. So, questions, please. Yeah.
In the early days of the Project for a New American Century, part of their white paper was that they were basically planning on a perpetual war. At the time, it was predicted to take at least 15 years, but depending upon how it expanded and spread, it became rather unclear as to what extent it would actually reach. And it seems to me that even though the PNAC appears to have disbanded, there may or may not be still elements within the government which are perpetuating this very same idea.
My dear friend, could you ask the question, please?
And I'm thinking that what would be ISIS's ultimate goal in terms of having a stand, as you were saying, that might actually create a bigger war.
What do you have anything to say? How would ISIS take a stand? I think this is a question that can go, or would take a stand that would actually provoke a larger war, a war larger than regional conflict, rather than regional conflict.
Well, I think what's interesting about the current situation in Syria and Iraq is how comfortable all the regional actors seem to be in continuing to instrumentalize ISIS, whether or not they deal with it directly. I'm not saying they deal with it directly, though they might. And that seems to be business as usual. So on that front, it seems as if people are not worried, that they're entirely happy to use ISIS directly or indirectly against their regional foes, all of whom are states, other states. So there's, even though the language has become, because of the sheer brutality of the phenomenon, so hysterical, and I use that word advisedly, on the ground, as far as I know, as far as I can tell, the calculations of the different regional actors seem to be entirely conventional. And that, I suppose, should worry us. I'm not one to be convinced by the sheer numbers of miles or acres of territory, much of which are desert and had never been controlled by anyone. I don't take that particularly seriously. It's, of course, the settled areas that are serious ones. I don't want to trade in predictions. I don't think it's a movement that will last. What has interested me is the way in which there seems to be an attempt to create, quite apart from the usual explanations we have of sociology, of ideology, of regional conflict, none of which can account for the diversity and the number of people who join the movement in full knowledge of its brutality. But what interests me is how the movement seems to be in search of, or at least to presume, the instantiation of something that is otherwise conceptual or theoretical, a legal subject in the Islamic sense here, to create a subject without any depth, to literally make the subject of law possible, because all that subject's language and actions are defined by invisible in the law. And that's what I think is actually very interesting, and that law doesn't need to be seen as some inherited structure from medieval times. It could be of any, it could be any form of law. So I think it's that's why I focus on the figure of the subject, because the militant subject will in the sense I've defined it, will outlive the movement itself. And if there's anything to worry about, it's that.
Thank you.
I wanted to try to bring together a point of Faisal's and a point of Emil's and ask you about the relationship between them. Thank you. So, Faisal, I take your point, and I think it's a deep one, that the U.S. need to externalize the conflict with Al-Qaeda to Iraq and Afghanistan helped produce the conditions in which ISIS would then want to fill that space. Yet I wonder if there's also something about externalization in parallel to Emil's description. On the one hand, the US declares this not exactly a war against the amorphous group of Al-Qaeda. And it does degrade Al-Qaeda slowly but surely over a long period of time, creating a kind of cycle in which Al-Qaeda becomes unattractive and dull in a certain way. Then the opportunity arises by virtue of the vacuum that's opened in Syria and that opens in the Sunni areas of Iraq for a response that will be something other than that degraded entity. It'll be something that wants to be a state or present itself as a state so that it can actually participate in a more familiar and identifiable war. The brilliance, of course, is that we'll have done this just at the point when the West is also so exhausted that it won't send troops. Right, so we've got this paradox where the West sends troops, the UK send troops to fight the non-state actor, and then when there is a state actor, they say, well, we can't possibly send troops because we've used up all of our troops. And then that turns, as you said, into a much greater success from the standpoint of ISIS. So I wonder if you would.
But is ISIS a state actor? Can I just ask?
I think ISIS is aspirationally a state actor.
But
yes, it controls some territory, and like a state, instead of going to the spot where the enemy is at its strongest, which is what Al-Qaeda did, that was actually somewhat apocalyptic. ISIS withdraws from the fight when it's overmatched and redeploys forces to other locations in just the way that a state does, with the goal of maintaining its degree of sovereignty. Okay. And most importantly, it depicts itself as a state. Yeah. So I think it not only depicts itself as a state, it is a proto-state now.
Okay, but it's a proto-state. It doesn't have recognition of a state.
It's not acknowledged internationally as a state. It may never be.
Thank you. Yeah, you mean.
Well, drawing together from your question other parts of this talk, I want to attach my answer to your concept of the distinction between the war that's not quite a war on the one hand and the familiar and identifiable war that we're not fighting or not prepared to fight perhaps on the other. And the broader point from today that is required to be made before one answers that question is this distinction between two types of asymmetry, to my mind. There is tactical asymmetry in war, which is common sense. You're always trying to achieve some kind of advantage over your opponent. That doesn't help us because it's pervasive in all conflict. The distinction which is useful is strategic asymmetry, by which I mean the extent to which the two sides, or let's say the parties to a conflict, perceive themselves to be in the same fight. If by analogy you take a soccer match and both sides think they are played by the same rules, they attribute the same meaning to a goal being scored or something. And your comment about the duel earlier today is the classic example at one end of that spectrum where there is literally asymmetry as to understanding. But it seems to me that most conflicts, when you move away from the dual on a spectrum, move gradually away from this symmetry of meaning. So in Vietnam, for example, there's that famous exchange between Colonel Summers and his Vietnamese counterpart after the war, where Colonel Summers says, "We won every battle," and his Vietnamese counterpart says, "Oh, that's true, but it's also irrelevant," because they weren't in that fight. So they're attributing a different meaning to the battle anyway. When terrorists use a bomb, they're not seeking to beat anybody militarily. They're sending a political message. In Afghanistan, when some coalition countries are in there, they might not win a fight, but their aim is not to take casualties. Their real aim is to please the US and get diplomatic support. So the whole mechanism that war provides as an interpretive structure to give meaning to events and thus produce a political result and contain war from peace starts to break down. And it seems to me that war is increasingly breaking down and becoming increasingly redundant as an interpretive structure. And so we're moving further down this spectrum away from the dual towards more and more asymmetrical conflicts in the strategic sense because of the information revolution, which creates network conflicts, multi-party conflicts, and therefore it's increasingly hard to have symmetry because of all these different groups. And you're left with intense competition to give meaning to events on the 24-hour news cycle, for example. And so there is a profound irony in your point, and in that when we finally have a conflict that we might actually win in the sense that the other side might actually agree with, we don't actually fight it.
Thank you. Yes, two questions.
Hi, thanks so much for the fascinating day here. I have a question. I kept hearing how the trouble is really the indistinction of the frontier, the indistinction of the uniform, and the indistinction of who the enemy is, where it is, and where is the war, and where is it being fought. And I'm wondering if kind of trying to constrain everything back to the law of war is in a way anachronistic, and is the problem that the distinction, that the indistinction doesn't enable us to use that toolkit any longer. And so it's a question for all of you, including Lital.
But what would you propose?
So I think that the issue of indistinction and the problem with that this is basically a problem of classification, in which international law and law of war, but all law of war cannot deal with the new formations, not only of states but also of MNCs, multinational corporations, and different types of privatization of power and of where the fight is happening, because it's not only happening in direct war but also in the backwater. So protest is also privatized in its own ways, and we all know how there's a difficulty in distinguishing between political threats and security threats, and that's one of the things that states have a very difficult time in boundary making. So, I mean, I don't have a suggestion what to do instead of the laws of war, but I thought maybe somebody here did.
Well, let me take Jennifer's question, and then we can, in fact, we've got all our...
Take a few more questions.
So let me take Jennifer's question.
A fascinating panel. My question is primarily for Professor Simpson. And it doesn't respond to the very good question just asked, but it's definitely adjacent to it. If we talk about the wars that are hard to the conflicts that are hard to characterize, and consider them indeterminate, certainly in their endpoints, I'm interested in how you would speak to the current categories in international humanitarian law, where you're basically saying that many additional Protocol 2 wars begin to blur into these other kinds of wars. And then there are many wars that didn't even get into AP2 category, but are only covered by Common Article 3. And if we are then saying the most primitive aspects of IHL, which are robust and humane, but primitive in terms of their regulation and iteration and practice on the ground, that is Common Article 3.
My dear Jennifer, there may be people who don't understand all these acronyms, if you wouldn't mind.
I'm sorry. So,
them out a little bit.
In international humanitarian law, the 4 Geneva Conventions apply only to wars between nation states. Then there is one that applies to civil war against it. There's one that applies to an expansion of protections of civilians in nation-state wars, which is additional protocol 1. Then there's one that applies to a state fighting against a civil war within its own boundaries. And now some of these civil wars have frayed into multilateral wars within a nation state. The state collapses, it becomes difficult to discern, or some of them are not even started as civil wars. So these, I think, are ones that we're facing here. They're conflicts. I totally accept your historical points about it. But given that lucid unraveling of our sense of what a war is now, my question is, does any element of international humanitarian law, particularly Common Article 3, which is common to all the Geneva Conventions and speaks to mercy and protection and humanity and care of prisoners, does that also not have bearing in your mind for these kinds of conflicts? And similarly, what do the humanitarians do, that is, humanitarian aid agencies and the humanitarian wings of the United Nations, when they're dealing with extensive civilian assault and suffering, when we all know that neutrality does not apply, but does that mean that the humanitarians need to find another set of rules to work with, which is what they're talking about now? So what are the implications for how we behave towards these wars is what I'm actually asking.
Thank you very much, Jen. You know, actually, I'm going to separate these questions, because one's a very specific question addressed to you. So if you take the first question, Vital, how would your response to the first question?
Well, it seems to me that what's at stake, if I understood the question correctly, is the distinction between semantics as just kind of a matter of ritual or inherited practice and the actual implications of just kind of redrawing the definition around what's actually happening on the ground. So I can't really speak to the legal aspect of it. That's not at all my field. I unfortunately deal with mere questions of discourse, rhetoric, representation, and that side of things. So I don't know, but it seems to me a fair question to say, I mean, if it doesn't look like a duck and it doesn't quack like a duck and it doesn't walk like a duck, maybe it's not a duck. Maybe it's time to just change our definition of warfare and just acknowledge that, war is not what it used to be. So I don't have any insight into, what would happen if you did that, but it seems, thinking on the level, purely on the semiotic level, it seems like a reasonable question. But I think that these two might be better equipped to deal with the implications.
So should we, if the whole realm of war, as you're suggesting, is so much part of industry, so much part of global capital, so much part of the security state, right outside of the state, in, the privatization of militias, go on. Then do we have to see it as completely permeated into everyday civil society, into the instruments of law, into the institutions we have? Should we be redefining a civic and civil life and peace in terms of war? Should we reverse it?
I mean, I think there are two precedents here. One, late 18th, throughout the 19th century, the idea of a race war, global, which of course has nothing to do with laws of war and of states. So, I mean, it's something that Foucault writes about and talks about politics beyond, underneath politics, right? So everyone thought, everyone meaning the figures who subscribe to this view, that the ordinary affairs of state are actually superficial and transient, and what's really happening, because they're thinking globally, is a race war. The institutionalized form of that, of course, is class war. Institutionalized because with the Soviet Union you have its institutionalization, and there too the language of war is absolutely crucial and is meant to determine the actions of states for the first time. With the race, of course, you also have that with Nazi Germany in particular, but it goes well beyond, or perhaps doesn't go as far as, the laws of war. So I think those two are actually very important modern day precedents for the idea of an unending and potentially apocalyptic war, which uses all the language and the categories of war, including institutions like the state, but that don't fit into the laws of war rhetoric.
Fine, right. At the same time, there's the other side of it. There's the race war, but then there is the ideology of progress, through the 19th century, the growth of historicism with its own teleology and modernization. So that, you know, the race war is folded in to those positive. So life, in a sense, although empire is the dominant architecture, or later on the Cold War, what has always seemed to be at stake is progress, modernization, democracy. You know, even in the acts of empire, it's democracy. So it's more complicated. I'm saying that there's another side to it, a kind of a defining and dissembling envelope of the race war. But now the suggestion seems to be that both the phenomenology and the politics of war are so all-pervasive, from what I hear, that there may be, you know, there are no boundaries. The areas are gray. There is in all hegemonic power, there is the kind of networks imploding from within. How do you, as somebody who served actually in a war and who's been on the ground, I mean, how do you see this phenomenon as we see it conceptually, or as it's been put about it conceptually? It's, you know, it's the Leviathan is now everywhere.
Right. Well, I can answer that question and your question together. It seems to me that the issue is not that conflicts are hard to characterize. What is hard is to shoehorn factual situations into legal concepts that weren't designed for those factual situations. The key factual situation in international armed conflict is there is this thing called military victory, and that goes back to the symmetry point. Both sides enter this this arena a bit like a legal trial, only with each side its own judge, effectively. And they say whoever is going to, we're going to have a military fight, and then after the military phase, we'll have a political phase. And there'll be a peace treaty to make the break. In a non-international armed conflict, you don't often have, they are not often amenable to the concept of military victory, because they are open-ended moments of armed politics, effectively, in which you use a range of means, some more usually associated with armed coercion, some more usually associated with civil means, peacetime means, to get a range of constituencies, amongst whom are the enemy, but most of whom might just be civilians whose political affiliation you want to gain, like the Sunnis in Anbar, who had legitimate grievances against an abusive Baghdad government, both in 2008 and today. And you are trying to get them to subscribe to a given political narrative. And that is not, once you've got them to subscribe to a given narrative, that you have to maintain it. There's no moment of military victory. And so any legal system that relies on the concept of military victory, which the concepts of military necessity and proportionality based on military advantage do, falls apart. And produces paradoxical results, where actually you expand the scope of the enemy. So in Afghanistan, drug dealers would be labeled as Taliban and be targetable as the enemy. And thus you actually end up paradoxically reducing their rights, because you can treat them not just as criminals, but enemies too. So the problem is not one of the difficulty of conceptual categorization of conflict. The problem is to do with trying to expand a category overly broadly and effectively confuse all situations which are just violent and therefore trigger the label of armed conflict as a factual phenomenon into a single jurisdictional concept, which is international armed conflict, when in fact non-international armed conflict is a fundamentally and categorically different jurisdictional conflict, which is intrinsically open-ended. And any attempt to shoehorn the first paradigm into the second will fall apart.
Yes, question here, please.
Just quickly on that last point, in sort of shifting to a tangential and related topic of hybrid warfare, how does that relate to when states and non-state actors are acting in coordination or in ways that are not necessarily overtly or have similarities with international armed conflict, but in ways that are either, I mean, for example, the Ukraine conflict, where Russian involvement, both directly and through non-international armed participants, sort of, I guess, muddies that distinction.
Who to answer? Yes, it does. But the key point is that you really have two ways in which you can organize a concept of war. One is based on personality, and one is based on guilt. If you base a concept on personality, then any moment in which you have conflicts in which the enemy cuts across two kinds of personality, sovereign, non-sovereign, like Ukraine, then that concept basically doesn't work. And that's what we're seeing in Ukraine. The concept of guilt is useful in that it allows us to have a coherent concept of the enemy which overrides considerations of personality. But then the risk is that you have a limitless conflict, because someone who clicks like on an Al-Qaeda, they're potentially the enemy. So you have to be very precise about your definition of that noxious thing that triggers the enemy identity. You know, are Boko Haram really part of IS just because a few people in Nigeria say they are, when actually, from what I understand, a lot of them are fighting the corruption there. You know, and if you say yes, and designate them as terrorists and you're AUMF, you end up swimming upstream against a global insurgency. So it's about being very precise once you use the guilt concept about the scope of the thing that the guilt is attached to in order to delimit war from peace.
Yeah.
All the comments about language were very interesting, Emil's etymologies. All the comments about language were very interesting, such as Emil's demonstration of the way these etymologies come up from long ago and are so relevant now, or Faisal's account of the use of hierarchy versus network. But I wanted to ask Littell in particular about the kind of appropriation or the invocation of the Holocaust image. I mean, you've studied so many narratives from both sides, and I couldn't get the picture of whether this is a kind of obsessive, exclusive analog that's being used, or whether across all the literature you study, this is one of 52 narratives that each side invokes, and this just happens to be the one in common, and whether there's almost a kind of, whether there's almost a kind of, I don't want to say stuttering, but as though there's a kind of entrapment in this analog that is perilous just by its monotony, and also to whom is it addressed? Is it a self-description? Is it a kind of legislative act of justifying acts of violence? Is it a journalistic act addressed to the outside world?
Wow, I think that the last part is possibly, in a way, the most important part of the question, because to whom is it addressed? I mean, again, so I think when someone like, when a very important writer, makes this analogy to the gas chambers, it's clearly, again, as he himself admitted, meant to shock and provoke. I'm talking about Saramago, right? I mean, to whom is it addressed? It's addressed to the international community, it's addressed to readers. When a Norwegian doctor in Tromsø, again, makes the same analogy, to say that what's happening is essentially as though, Norway were being bombed by the Nazis. It's, it depends on the context in which you're publishing. If you're publishing it in a newspaper, it's clearly, meant to be addressed at a global readership. When, on the other hand, it's made implicitly within literature, then it's much more complex. And that then goes back to the first part of your question, why this particular obsession, why this trope? Well, I think that, Edward Said, wrote about this all the way back in the 1970s, this problem of the uses and abuses of the Holocaust on both sides and the competitive victimization and all of that. I think that the reason, is fairly straightforward. The irony is too good to not be exploited, right? Of talking, Said himself said that the Palestinians are the victims of the victims, but he was not saying it in a way that was anyway meant to insert this whole problem of the, appropriation or the competition. He was just making that point, and he himself critiqued, the use of the Holocaust. But I think that it's kind of irresistible, for people people can't avoid making this comparison because it is so powerful because of the historical specificity of Jews turned oppressor. So the problem is that what's happening is, such a kind of stereotypical flattening into, this complex problem into a kind of ultimate good and an ultimate evil, so that it's not really doing anything except for, creating inflammatory rhetoric. I think that there is a kind of obsession with the Holocaust, not only within the media discourse, but within the cultural discourse. As I was trying to show, there's a connection between the two. It's maybe more complex and there are more areas of gray in the cultural discourse. But I mean, so many iconic texts and images from within these cultures rely on this comparison. It's unavoidable. So for instance, the major Palestinian story writer Hassan Kanafani, who was assassinated by the Mossad in Beirut in the early 1970s, is really well remembered, perhaps best remembered for his novella Returning to Haifa, whose premise is that a Palestinian family that was separated from their infant son in 1948, and they left him in Haifa within Israel, within the 1948 borders. They themselves wind up in the West Bank. After the borders are reopened in '67, they go back to Haifa to find their son. They go back to their old house, and they find that it's been occupied by Holocaust survivors. And they have this long discussion with them. This is a really, really formative text for Palestinian national consciousness. So to some extent, ironically, even if the comparisons are kind of being flung about carelessly and in a way that doesn't really do anything productive, they're also really entrenched within the national consciousness on both sides in ways that are much more complex. That's just one example. But I could go on and on. I mean, they're just all over the place and they're used in many different ways. The other thing I will say is that, of course, as we know, all of trauma studies pretty much in the academy grows out of Holocaust studies. They're fundamentally linked. I'm talking about Shoshana Feldman and Kathy Caruth and others. And so even within Palestinian scholarship in many, many disciplines, all of the kind of evocation of this scholarship on trauma goes back to the Holocaust. And that's something that I find also really fascinating on a discursive level, taking these kind of works of criticism as primary texts and trying to understand why is it that even Palestinian scholarly narratives of memory, the memory studies and the trauma studies, have this really deep connection to the Holocaust work that's not kind of fundamentally explored as sort of taken for granted. So to answer your question, I mean, in terms of audience, it clearly depends on whether we're talking about an academic work or a film or an article in the New York Times. But I think that it reaches different people in different ways. One question that I would ask is, why don't we see more analogies to the Holocaust in other contexts? So I was thinking about ISIS, for instance, and there was a piece recently in Newsweek, is it fair to compare ISIS to Nazis, right? And I was kind of surprised that there hadn't been more on this, and that the comparison is not kind of more widely bandied about, considering how common it is in the context of Israel-Palestine. But just one more final thought. Some of you might be familiar with Godwin's Law. Anyone heard of this? So that was, somebody, Michael Godwin back in 1990 said in any kind of online conversation, there is a direct connection between the length of the conversation, be it, Facebook or anything else, and as the length grows longer and longer, the probability grows closer to 1 that somebody will eventually evoke Hitler, and that whoever brings up Hitler first loses the rhetorical battle. So this is something that is not just, it's clearly not exclusive to Israel-Palestine, but it certainly characterizes that discourse.
Let me, I'm going to take the privilege of, you want, yes, please.
This is just a brief question for Litao. What I missed in your analysis was a comparative dimension that would go in another direction. Mm-hmm. You can't just theorize about one case. You've always got to compare that case with other cases.
Sure.
So we would want to look to other communities where other traumas are used as a point of reference in the same way.
Sure.
Or are we going to assume that the use of the Holocaust in this particular specificity is unique? I mean, I would find it very interesting to see a comparative analysis of the discourse, for example, in the United States, of comparing modern-day race problems with slavery.
Right.
Or in, I don't know, in Ireland always bringing up the Oliver Cromwell massacres or some such thing as that to try to get a general theory of such discourse. All you've done, it seems to me, is just probe into this one example. Do you have any thoughts on that broader category of this type of thing?
Well, actually, so Michael Rothberg, who I referenced, has written a book called Multidirectional Memory, in which he actually kind of takes the Holocaust in that direction that you're describing right now, where he's thinking about sort of transcultural uses of Holocaust comparisons, but specifically in reference to other unrelated historical experiences looking at slavery and colonialism. So that type of work is being done. What I was actually hoping to do with this kind of limited exercise was to take it in a different direction, because everyone's always, again, looking at that question of when it's a competition over the suffering in that kind of zero-sum fashion. And I was really curious, again, about when you change the affective dimension of it from one of that sort of aggressive, proprietary type of comparison towards the comparison with the other that initially begins as a gesture of recognition and empathy, but isn't able to break out of the mold to take it all the way. And that was specifically why I was just looking at this one case of liberal Israeli discourse, where, again, the idea is I'm going to see the other, and I'm going to acknowledge the humanity and the suffering of the other through the use of my own historical experience. But in the end, ironically, rather than doing it, to really kind of understand them and in terms of the individuality of their historical experience, it comes back to the self as, again, saying we're both victims. And I was particularly just interested in that notion of how is commensurability achieved? If for the suicide bomber, it's about trying to find reciprocality and commensurability of power, and it can only be fulfilled in a shared death, for the intellectual or the liberal politician, it's really about trying to find a moral commensurability, which is very difficult for the more powerful party that's the aggressor. And the only way that can be achieved is through this notion of shared victimhood. And so that specifically was really what I was trying to explore in this. That was why I was focusing on that one example, because I think it is counterintuitive to think about this idea of reciprocity on a moral or ethical level, which I think, again, is a fallacy, because it completely overlooks the asymmetry of power.
I want to thank the panelists. I want to suggest, just very briefly, because it really is